So, thanks. Cool. Whoa. So, resolved in the United States, national service ought to be compulsory. This topic is interesting in a number of ways. The first thing to realize is that the terms national service ought to be compulsory cover a potentially wide range of things. So what we want to do is first talk a little bit about the history. If you can move forward. Yeah. So the first thing we want to do is talk a little about the history of national service, and both the way it's manifested itself in the United States, as well as a very brief overview with some of the ways that national service works itself out in other countries. Then we're going to talk about some definitional concerns, because what exactly national service amounts to, what exactly means to make it compulsory is not always clear. And there's actually contestation about which projects would actually count as national service. So we'll talk a little about the different options that might emerge in that regard. While we're doing that, we'll also briefly mention various search terms that you might find useful as you're doing your own research. Because we don't just talk about national service. People also talk about things like military conscription or the AmeriCorps program. And so we'll talk about different things you can be looking for when researching, which might clue you into this being or not relevant or not relevant to the topic at hand. After that, we'll talk about some general affirmative arguments, as well as some specific affirmative arguments that build themselves off of particular literature bases that are particularly common in debate. Then we'll talk about some general principle negative arguments on the resolution, and then some potentially specific or more nuanced negative arguments that again build off particular literature bases that are common in debate, certain groups of articles or books.
All right, so what exactly is the history of national service? There are a bunch of different definitions, and obviously we're going to talk about that, but the term originated from the National Service Armed Force Act of 1939, which was enacted during World War II in the United Kingdom in response to Germany. Conscription was required for males who are 18 to 41 years of age, and it has been modified after the war and has had different manifestations in different countries. When compulsory, usually the norm is that it's for people who are 18 and over, and that has been enforced internationally. When it's voluntarily, usually in the United States, or at least in the United States, it only requires 3 months of military training for you to be involved in national service. The United States has used conscription in the past, and some of you probably found that out in your preliminary research that you did during lab. But it used it during the Civil War, World War I and II, as well as the Cold War, to make sure that they had enough armed forces. And although the United States doesn't currently deploy a draft, thankfully, it maintains the selective service program, so in the event that it really needs to, it's able to do so.
Okay. So up here you'll see a map of the world, and you'll notice that a large number of countries, the blue, the red, and to a lesser extent the orange, have some version of conscription. So it's not without precedent. Countries like Israel, North and South Korea, Singapore have relatively long periods of service, 2 years or more. And so in some countries, you might spend the first 2 years of your adult life in the military. Not too uncommon geographically across the globe. Even in some of the countries that don't have military conscription, they have some other national service programs that might fall within the area of this topic. And we'll discuss the definitions in a second. But for example, Nigeria has a program where anyone who's a college graduate under the age of 30, they're not required to serve in the military, but they're required to spend a year doing stuff like teaching in rural areas, or if they're a doctor practicing medicine for the good of society as a form of compulsory service before they can actually go out and practice on their own. South Africa has a similar program for their physicians. And so you'll see some countries, even if they don't have military service, do have some sort of nationally expected service of you in the form of a compulsory civil program.
When we talk about national service, in the United States context specifically, there are generally 3 programs that are commonly mentioned. This is the draft, or military conscription, AmeriCorps, which is run under the Corporation for National and Community Service, and the Peace Corps. Each of these programs do slightly different things, and sometimes very different things. The Peace Corps does a lot of work sending people overseas to various countries to do different types of peace building or community service activities for various types of nation development. AmeriCorps does sometimes, in some sense, the same thing, but here at home in the United States. They'll do things like infrastructure development, or mentoring in inner cities, or providing other sorts of community development programs in various places. In general, it works by partnering with various nonprofit programs. An important thing to realize about both of these is that both Peace Corps and the AmeriCorps programs have far, far, far more applicants than they do spots available. The Peace Corps only has about 4,000 spots, but it gets easily over 20,000 applicants each year. The AmeriCorps program has more spots, but it's not even near the 400,000 applicants that it gets yearly for those grants. So what you see is that there's a lot more people, or what the literature claims is that there's a lot more people who are interested in doing this sort of national service through these national service programs, but who are unable to do so. So what most of the affirmative articles on this topic advocate for is some combination of expanding military, AmeriCorps, and Peace Corps programs so that everyone participates. And then this will be added in a compulsory way. So everyone will have to participate in the military, or in AmeriCorps, or in Peace Corps, or something else similar, is what most of the literature advocates for. A common place you'll see this advocacy is people who defend a reinstituting of military conscription. And what they'll often say is we should have everyone have to join the military, but if for some religious or ethical reason they object to military service, then they should have the option to join AmeriCorps or Peace Corps. So what you'll often see in the literature is that the military conscription is treated as the primary option, and AmeriCorps and Peace Corps are treated as secondary options that you can apply for if you feel some objection to military service.
And even though the literature talks about military service or national service in that particular way, some of the time there are still general questions that all apps need to be prepared to answer, and all negs should be asking. So the first is whether national service includes those three things: AmeriCorps, Peace Corps, and military service. The other aspect is, does national indicate that it should be applied to all? So there are potentially affirmatives that can say national service is required for doctors, or national service is required for college graduates. Is that something that's topical under the context of the resolution? Are you allowed to specify national service to a particular group, even though national probably connotates some type of understanding of everyone being mandated to do it, whether they are of a certain age or certain denomination, etc. And that will be talked about in the specification as well.
Another aspect to this general question is the term compulsory. So there's some people who argue that compulsory service is generally used to refer to some form of universal service. This is not always the case, right? We often think about the draft as compulsory, even though not everyone had to participate, not everyone was drafted. But the argument goes there was still universal since everyone had to be entered into the draft. So the idea is that certain compulsory government programs are supposed to conceptually be universal in certain ways.
That being said, with certain examples, there's also this idea that national service is supposed to specifically refer to conscription or drafts. So some of the literature doesn't even grant that AmeriCorps or Peace Corps should be included. It only specifies it in the context of military service and mandating that people enroll in that. So that's a question that needs to be entertained or asked. Additionally, national service can also be seen as a specific service or for a specific group. For example, jury duty can potentially be seen as some type of national service where everyone is mandated to serve on jury duty once they come of age, or perhaps doctoral services. As Jacob mentioned, for example, in countries like Nigeria, where people are, some people, especially in their physician programs, are forced to participate for at least a year or two in helping their community or helping their country more generally before they go into their careers or go into their adult life. Likewise, there are also articles that can talk about things like organ procurement, how even in your dying days, or if you decide to be an organ donor, organ procurement or donating your organs, for those of you who aren't familiar with the term, is something that should still be considered a national service. And those are different specific services that can be entertained. But that also entertains the question of specification about how exactly we mandate something like national service. So first is, who does this apply to, right? Is it going to apply to those who are 18 and over? Is it going to apply to certain populations, additional point is when. When exactly is this going to happen? And how is this going to happen? Are we going to be doing it by lottery? Are we going to be sending random letters to everyone? Are we going to do it through a particular system, etc.? And additionally, how long? Different institutions have different sets of time for people to serve national service. For example, 1 year, 2 year, or even more than that. Those are things that you can try to ask the affirmative to specify in order for you to have a better understanding of what type of form of national service that they're defending.
So we'll start with the affirmative arguments and cover a few core affirmative arguments that you're likely to see pretty often. First is there might just be an unfilled need. If you let people do whatever they want to do voluntarily, certain jobs might not get done. The most obvious is defense of the nation. You might argue that not enough people would voluntarily sign up to go abroad in times of war and put themselves in the front line. For example, in World War I, before we had a draft, we only had, I think, 73,000 of a million desired recruits, part of why we had a draft in 1917. And so you might argue that the jobs that need to be done won't get filled, military or otherwise. And in some of these other contexts of not military service, but something like AmeriCorps or Peace Corps, you might argue that we don't have enough people voluntarily choosing to engage in things like building up our own country or helping out other countries abroad. And so that we need a compulsory service in order to ensure that we have enough people to meet demand. Secondly, a common affirmative argument you might hear is an argument about egalitarianism. Who is affected by these policies? One argument the affirmative might make is that if military recruitment comes voluntarily just from people who are willing to sign up, disproportionately the people who tend to be willing to sign up for the military are people who are already disadvantaged in society. People who are economically disadvantaged or don't feel they have job prospects and need that money to go to college tend to be the ones who sign up for the military. And so you'll find a disproportionate amount of people serving in the military are people who are coming from the lowest economic rungs of our socioeconomic ladder. And so some people might argue there's something problematic about having our military fought by our poorest citizens and not being representative of the country as a whole. And there's just something intrinsically wrong about the unfair distribution of who actually has to die for national defense. A related but more pragmatic argument is that conscription might actually curtail military adventurism. Military adventurism being a term to refer to when we engage in unnecessary wars, like we intervene or adventure into other countries when we don't need to. And you might want to argue that cases like Vietnam are cases where we don't want to go in, we went into another country foolhardily, or Iraq, and we don't want the country to do that in the future. And so on the affirmative side, the argument might be, if we have a draft, we're less likely to repeat those cases because the military is not going to be comprised solely of poor people who have little economic say or little political sway in when we go to war, but also people like the sons or daughters of policymakers, people who are the offspring of rich, wealthy individuals, famous actors, and so on. People from every aspect of society will be representing our military. And so everyone in society will know someone potentially affected by a new war. And so it would be less likely to send troops to fight and die if we didn't think it was absolutely necessary for the defense of the country. And so some people argue that military conscription would actually reduce the likelihood of the country going to war because more people and more segments of society would have their lives on the line, and the military would be viewed as less expendable. Next, there's a few more pragmatic arguments that one might make for conscription. One is civil-military relations. This is another one that will come up pretty commonly, kind of related to the last argument I was describing, which is that one problem that you see sometimes in countries is that their military branch is too separated from the civilian life. And so you'll have a problem where the military is entirely disconnected from their concerns at home, and vice versa. Often you'll see things like a coup result from that, where the military hostilely seizes power. And this can be a problem because it means that the country's goals and the military's goals aren't always going to line up, which can lead to poor war fighting. It can lead to inability of the civilians to control the military, and just general problems with our ability to effectively use offensively and defensively our military capabilities to the best of our ability. And so one argument for the draft might be that it means, again, that there's not this one segment of society that does the fighting, and then another segment of society that does the political aspects, the civilian aspects, but rather the military is more representative of society as a whole. And so you're likely to see more people who served in the military and then go back to be prominent civilian politicians or other notable figures. And so you're more likely to have people in the civilian sphere who can, empathize with or connect with the military in a way that makes the civilian and military spheres much less distinct. For example, right now, far fewer of our current Congress people were former combatants in war than, say, in the 1970s. Some argue that might be in part due to military conscription. Perhaps one of the reasons why there were far more people who were serving in Congress in the 70s who had been in war was because in the 40s, when there was a war, they were conscripted to serve. Whereas nowadays, the people who are likely to become politicians are probably the ones who are able to avoid the military just by choosing not to enroll because they didn't need the money. And so you might find that if the military is a conscript based, you'll have a more representative segment of society, and that can be better for civilian military relations. Second, it can be better for United States primacy. Primacy here referring to the United States' ability to be the world leader militarily. There's many potential benefits. Many other countries rely on us for the defense. South Korea, Japan, Europe, all allies of ours who, to some degree or other, rely on United States protection. We have defensive agreements with all those countries. NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, is the United States and many European countries working together in a combined defensive effort. And so if the United States military is stronger, all these other countries might feel safer from their aggressors regionally. And so one argument you might make for the draft is we have a stronger military and are more capable of engaging in national defense or defense of the globe because we know we have a reliable source of troops. We're going to need to go to war. And then lastly, those arguments about the military, remember national service could potentially include, or at least you could argue that it includes, other forms of service beyond military service. And so if your argument was that they engage in civilian projects like infrastructure development or teaching, or say the discussion of physicians, you might argue that all these other things have pragmatic benefits as well, and that it would bolster our society as a whole because we have more people fulfilling those jobs.
There are also really interesting critical arguments on this topic. The first one that I'm going to talk about is in the context of race. This article by Melissa Bochi talks about the ways in which national service can help us unlearn or rupture understandings of whiteness. So her argument is that national service is something that mandates that people remove themselves from positions of privilege that they are in. So for example, if a privileged individual is required through something like AmeriCorps to work in low-income areas or interact with communities or people that they have never met before, it forces them to get out of their comfort zone and interact with the other. So her argument is that national service creates a site for us to be able to rupture this notion. If it is true that race becomes a question of social construct, it is important that we find ways to be able to deal with those constructs, and in order for us to be able to do that, she argues this is a tangible way in which we can force people to deal with issues of race when they don't want to. Which is one of the more general arguments that you might find. It's also some of the trend of arguments that you might find if you want to write a soft left affirmative. A lot of times it's going to be in the context of Peace Corps or AmeriCorps and the ways in which that allows for them to unlearn things like colonialism or racism and things along those lines. Which brings us to the second argument that you can end up going for in the context of a critical affirmative, which is in the realm of literature called decoloniality or post-colonial studies. Post-colonial studies attempts to understand the ways in which colonialism interacts and reinvigorates power dynamics and power structures that would exist within society. This article by Jenna Hanchey, if you access it, you'll see that for 120 pages, it seems like it's going to negate, and it seems like it's saying something like Peace Corps is really terrible and awful, but once you get to the section where she talks about how actually Peace Corps has a lot of potential for us to be able to unlearn colonialism, you'll find that she heavily flows affirmative. So her argument is that the use of Peace Corps, similar to Bochi's argument, allows for us to challenge things like colonialism on an international scale. So what happens is, for example, people in the United States, be they from whatever racial denomination that they're in, are forced into contexts where, once again, they're made to feel very uncomfortable. She uses the example of this white guy who ends up doing Peace Corps in Ghana, and he talks about how when he was in those particular societies, people looked at him in a really weird way, and he had never been singled out. That white person who was existing in that particular area. And what ended up happening is, instead of him saying, oh, they were looking at me in a way that was jealousy or reverence, or they're admiring my white skin, he argued that he felt different and that was okay. And rather, he recognized that there was no intrinsic beauty in his own identity, but rather it was normative or wonderful or beautiful for other people to have different physical or different cultural understandings of what their origin or relationship to being was. So she uses a bunch of different narratives of people who were in the Peace Corps organization or Peace Corps missions, and how they were forced to unlearn their Americanism, their citizenship, their whiteness, their privilege, etc., in order for them to create a space where they can rupture different forms of colonialism. She would also argue that colonialism isn't something that just happens in the context of going to other countries and controlling their resources or controlling their lives, but rather it's something that takes place internally, i.e. there can be a colonization of the mind, the way in which we use certain stereotypes or mindsets to be able to see certain bodies in traditional ways or stereotypical ways. So what Peace Corps or organizations like Peace Corps or forms of national service that force people out of their comfort zone do is decolonize the mind or decolonize the ways in which people relate to each other. And then the final argument comes from the same article, and it's really interesting in terms of the ways in which things like Peace Corps can actually demonize the United States and rupture the narrative of the United States being this benevolent, powerful nation. So she uses the example of the ways in which people see white women in particular engaging in forms of missionary work or engaging in things like Peace Corps. There are a lot of blogs and statistics going around from more conservative people, but also mainstream media in the United States that argued that sexual assault and harassment was more prevalent in a lot of these other countries. They're mostly citing countries in the general continent of Africa, where, for example, 1,000 white women were said to be raped over the course of 10 years by random people in those different countries. What she argued is that that perpetuates the narrative of sexual assault and sexual harassment that people use to say that, oh, it's strangers who perpetuate violence against women. It's strangers who end up making women feel lesser or not superior. It's strangers who end up making women feel uncomfortable. And it uses this idea of America is the safe, wonderful place that you should be in order for you to have all of your freedoms. What people who are in Peace Corps recognize is that actually a lot of those instances were very few and far in between, even though they were unfortunate. And actually, in places like the United States, 1 in 6 women are more likely to be raped by people who they know. So it challenged the ways in which the United States can't have access to a very safe narrative, or the idea that they're going to be this benevolent place that will protect all people, and forces people to recognize the ways in which the United States is not only complacent in, for example, colonialism, as she talks about in a different section of the article, but also things like patriarchy and power relations, etc.
So a lot of these arguments get really complicated. The important thing to remember is that what you're looking for, if you're getting confused, is that there are a couple of core ideas, core themes, that seem to broadly connect with the ideas of national service. And one of these core ideas that's been brought up by both Jacob and Sunhee, and then I'm going to talk about a little bit more from a slightly different perspective, is just the way that national service can be important in improving ourselves as people and becoming better. That things like national service might play this sort of important role. One way that we might think about it playing this important role is that it allows us to become better, in some sense, citizens. That there's a responsibility as members of a democracy to have a certain attitude towards our participation with other people. And that national service is a way of insisting that as citizens, we take up these associated responsibilities. So when you're a citizen in the United States, that affords you certain freedoms and privileges. The freedom to vote, for example. And these freedoms, the idea is, should come with associated responsibilities. Just as you might think that at home, in order to get some allowance, you should have to do various chores around the house, or in order to get money, you should have to have some sort of job. So too, you might think that to get certain privileges and rights within a society, this should be accompanied by recognition that we have obligations to help the nation who is doing these things for us. One place this comes up is in a literature base known as communitarianism. The idea of communitarianism is really just the idea that individual people aren't really that individual. What you are is not something you created yourself. Instead, it's a consequence of your family relationships, who your friends are, where you went to school, the activities you engage in, what you learn at church, or whatever other religious participation you have, the way that different activities you've done have shaped your values. And because we're these deeply communal creatures, we need to understand the social obligations we have as parts of this community. And national service, the idea goes, is a way to recognize this sort of commitment. There are also arguments made that are specifically about things like taking on responsibility. So there are concerns that, from a communitarian perspective, when there's not an obligation to national service, then all connection with the government kind of becomes depersonalized. I give the government my money via taxation and that's it. That's as much as I interact with. There's nothing really of myself, right, that goes into that communal relationship. The concern that you might have is that when we safeguard these individual liberties, we harm the quality of democracy by creating a group of citizens so focused on the pursuit of their own private goods rather than the service of the public good. And that as a country, we shouldn't allow that. We should demand or insist that those people who have gained public goods be concerned with the public good and give back to the public good in various ways. This can be coupled with various studies which talk about the way participation in things like Peace Corps and AmeriCorps might improve things like political participation. So there seems to be evidence that those involved in the military, for example, vote at a higher rate than those not involved in the military. And then those who were previously involved in the military also vote at a higher rate. If that's true, it might be that requiring national service increases the sort of democratic participation that we as a society would value. Another philosophical approach, which would also talk about the importance of this sort of participation democracy, is a tradition known as civic republicanism. Now this is going to be a little confusing, because when you think about republicanism, we normally think about Republicans. But republicanism is a very different tradition. Republicanism is a political philosophy that originates in ancient Roman philosophy. And it starts with the idea that government institutions are things that we really shouldn't trust unless they're set up to be kind of very limiting. So for a civic republican, the primary question is not necessarily, is the government currently doing something bad? But instead, what sort of checks do we have to make sure the government can't do something bad? If the government is able to do bad things, even if it's currently not doing that, that itself is problematic because we should not trust people with power. Power tends to corrupt people, the argument goes. And as such, we should set up institutions which are going to create these demands and checks on the government. A common argument that Republicans make is that as such, things like democracy are hard. That if we don't have a citizenry who's really engaged politically, it becomes very hard to check back against what the government does. One example of this is that there are some Republicans, in particular Michael Lind, who make arguments about how we need to, for example, have national service where local communities serve in their own police forces. Because unless we have that, there's no way to ensure that police forces are actually looking out for the goods of the communities rather than the private goods of those who want to become police officers because of the sense of power it gives them. Similarly, there might be worries that when the government military is just run by the people who want to join the government, then it might be that the military has too much trust of government orders. Because the only people joining the military are those who choose to join the military, that might mean that the people working for the government like the government too much, or trust the government too much. A civic Republican might think that that's problematic, that we should not that we should have people in power, people in things like military power, be coming from populations that might distrust the government. And it seems like conscription of various sorts might be the only way to achieve that sort of effect. One last argument I want to mention that might approach this resolution from a more philosophical perspective is an argument grounded in various social contract traditions. In particular, the social contract traditions of Thomas Hobbes Rousseau, and some contemporary people like Michael Walzer. The article I have up here by Pemberton II, very important sounding name, Defense of the Realm, Conscription and Social Contract Theory, talks about a reason why the social contract tradition that's defended by people like Thomas Hobbes includes a claim that we need military conscription or other forms of national service. And the idea is that certain types of activity within the public domain are the collective responsibility of everyone. So defending the nation isn't the obligation of just a few people, it's instead the obligation of all of us as a collective. That there is a sort of collective obligation to protect one another, to band together for mutual protection, and that can only be satisfied if we're going to maintain something like universal conscription, or something like universal national service, where we all participate in the activity of governing well. We finally want to talk about a couple of stranger acts that you might come across as you research it. None of us are convinced that these acts are actually talking about what the resolution asks. Indeed, I'm pretty convinced that none of them are. Nevertheless, there might be people who try to make the topic about these other things. One example that you see a lot is jury duty. The reason for this is because jury duty is often used as an example when talking about other forms of compulsory service. So people will say, just like jury duty is okay, so too the draft is okay. Or if you think that we can't conscript people to serve in AmeriCorps, you'd also have to think that we can't have jury duty. There are certain connections between jury duty. Once you become an adult, then you have to serve on a jury if you are summoned. This is an obligation that everyone in the country has. And you might think that serving this obligation is one that is compulsory national service. Obviously, there are questions like most people talking about national service want to talk about jury duty. Similarly, most jury is not federal. It's about state crimes and local laws. It's not about federal crimes. So there's a question about whether or not this is really talking about the resolution at all. There are also, as we mentioned before, articles that talk about very specific kinds of national service. Whether or not teachers, for instance, can be required to go to rural areas. Whether or not doctors can be required to work in rural areas. Whether or not engineers in times of emergencies, or other things of that sort. So there seems to have been a Supreme Court case somewhere after, what was it? Do you remember? I don't know. Yeah, some hurricane came and destroyed a bunch of stuff, and the government was like, all right, all these people have to go rebuild roads without pay. Just got to do it. There's a pressing social interest. And the Supreme Court said that was okay. So there may be other aspects to engineering which might also be an act that people would defend, or an affirmative argument about compulsory national service. It could also potentially get even weirder. We found one article, or Chris Tice found one article, which said that organ donation after you die is a form of national service, or a form of community service similar to AmeriCorps. So like, when I die and you take my kidney and give it to someone else, that might be a sort of national service. There are also people who say that we should just get rid of voting and instead appoint people to Congress just by lottery. So we just like run a lottery and whoever comes up, they're in Congress. Which, you know, you think about it, you're like, what's the biggest problem with government? Well, it's all run by politicians. You know, that would solve that problem, right? Things like that might also be a form of compulsory national service if you looked at some of the really weird proposals people have for how governments might want to be run.
Next slide.
Yes, please.
Now we'll move on to a few of the negative arguments. So, one negative argument is about individuals' rights against the government, and whether or not conscripting you to do things, e.g. fight and die in the military, is a violation of your rights. One line of argument might be that you have a right not to be required to kill other people. This is the basic fundamental right, and that sort of obligation to fight or kill on behalf of your government would be some sort of egregious violation of one's own rights. Or, more broadly, you might just have a concern that the government shouldn't be allowed to force you to do things against your will, whatever your reason is. Maybe as it happens, you aren't too terribly opposed to shooting other people in wartime, but it's still not the government's right to tell you that you have to do that. And so some people are going to argue that you should have the liberty to decide for yourself whether or not to join the military, whether or not to choose a particular profession. And that any sort of government intervention that requires certain individuals to do things on behalf of the country is the government overstepping its legitimate bounds. Secondly, there's an argument about military effectiveness, that even though you might have a larger number of troops or a more reliable number of troops in a world where there's conscription, because you know you can just force people into the ranks if needed, that's actually not going to lead to quality warfighting, because most of those people are probably not going to be highly motivated. Some might be actively antagonistic if they don't like being forced into the military, so they're probably not going to try their hardest. There's probably not going to be very much cohesion amongst the units, and in general, a conscripted army might be much less effective at warfighting than a group of people who voluntarily chose to enlist to do a duty of service to their country. And so you'll find many people who argue that the military can become more effective without a draft, because the draft actually undermines the sort of internal or intrinsic motivation people have to fight war by forcing people to do it. And then the adventurism argument that we discussed earlier also can show up on the negative. Some argue that a draft actually increases countries' propensities to go to war, because, say, politicians' sons and daughters might inevitably find a loophole around that gets them out of the conflict. But if the politicians themselves know that they reliably can just force people into conflict, then it's much easier to wage a war, because you don't first need to draw up public support and get people to voluntarily enlist. You can just tell them to enlist and then go fight the war using that army. So think Vietnam. Vietnam seems perhaps more of a negative example here. You could argue that it was a very unpopular war, and if the government had to get people to voluntarily sign up to fight the Vietnam War, we might not have been able to, or might not have been able to last as long as we did in a costly and potentially pointless endeavor. And then there's also concerns about cost. National service, which is compulsory for most or all people across the country, is obviously going to cost a whole lot. That's the government paying the check for you in the army, and not just in terms of your wages, but also they're housing you, they're feeding you. If you're on a service abroad, they're paying for you to go to another country in the Peace Corps or work domestically in AmeriCorps. And imagine the amount of money. You're cutting somebody a 5-figure check, and you have tens of millions of people in the, say, 18 to 20-ish demographic that have been conscripted for whatever job. And you're paying 10 million people a check of 5 figures, so in the tens of thousands of dollars. Y'all can do the math and you realize it's a good bit of money. It's pretty expensive use of the government's funds. Likewise, a second economic argument, potentially, is that those people are also people who otherwise would have been going into the labor force. Especially, imagine the high-skilled individuals who, say, have the ability to take up high-paying or very important jobs in society, and instead are spending years in the military or in Peace Corps or in some other service organization. In Louisiana, potentially you said they could be being productive, or at least more productive than they currently are. And so you might argue that the government requiring people to work is going to trade off with a large portion of the private sector, especially many of the people who might not be most fit for government service and are more fit for a different job or more trained for a different job, being forced to work in the military anyway, might be less economically efficient. And you'll find many economic arguments in that regard. So, moving on to the pragmatic section of the negative arguments, we just discussed the economic one. I think this one is obviously a pragmatic concern, but a relatively common one that's raised. Secondarily, there's also a lot of political controversy surrounding the draft. It was ultimately ended after Vietnam. Vietnam was a very unpopular war, and a lot of that unpopularity was directed against the draft because people didn't like being forced to go abroad to a war they didn't support. And so you might argue that bringing back the draft would be extremely politically controversial, and that could have very many negative ramifications. It might undermine the political sphere, increase partisanship, or prevent other productive policies from getting passed. And then another potential pragmatic concern is that the draft might actually have effects on the political opinions of individual people or government organizations. So there's some evidence to suggest, I think Marshall referenced, positively, people might be more willing to vote if they go into the military. There's also some evidence to suggest that going to the military might change your political opinions. You might become more conservative. Obviously, if you're serving in the military, that tends to increase one's willingness to accept authority figures, pretty heavily ingrained into you in the military. Conversely, you might see the opposite effect at the organizational level, which is that the people who tend to go into the military tend to be people who are already relatively conservative and accepting of things like the military as an institution. And so a draft would actually get a wider political cross-section of the population. And so in a conscripted military, you'd end up having more people who are already liberal in the military, and that would actually make the military as an organization more left-leaning, at the same time that might make the population more right-leaning. And then, depending on the argument you make, either of those could have positive or negative ramifications that could be potentially significant across the population.
On the next side, if you try to do a lot of critical research, you'll find that they're very, very neg biased. So this is only 4 examples, but there are so many different ways in which you can negate the topic in a critical way. The first and more common author that many of you are probably familiar with is Henry Giroux. He writes a lot about things like militarism and neocolonialism. For those who aren't really familiar with something like militarism, it's just the process in which social, economic, and political institutions are organized to reflect and produce violence against those who are considered to be against the nation state. So in his article, called War Culture, Militarism, and Racist Violence Under Trump, he says that it's particularly problematic for us to engage in vigorous forms of militarism, or militarism in general, because it's only going to perpetuate more violence. So in the context of this topic, if an affirmative is requiring that everyone is a part of the military, even though we've talked about how on the affirmative that can probably create some type of idea of people becoming better people, Giroux would say that's false, because all of it is entrenched in an idea of taking over the other, or defending U.S. hegemony, or making the United States look like a strong person. So regardless of whether you're doing Peace Corps, or regardless of whether you're doing AmeriCorps, or whether you're actually in the military, you're only re-entrenching the ways in which the United States perpetuates violence in other countries. Some clear examples of that will be a lot of the readings that you might find about the ways in which Peace Corps or AmeriCorps perpetuate a lot of harm in either low-income communities in the United States or a lot of harm abroad, because they come into these countries or go into these communities with a mindset of being a savior, of a mindset of being benevolent, of a mindset of being the perfect fix for all of their problems, and telling them what to do. That only replicates a violence, not only in terms of social aspects, but it can also be very physical. When we have something like a standing army, when we're ready to dispense bodies endlessly in order to fight some battle to protect the nation state, that makes it a lot more, it makes other countries more vulnerable to the attack or trigger-happy tendencies that the United States has. And it also allows for a war culture to not only pervade and destroy lives abroad, but to also pervade the ways of life that exist within society as well. Another author, Tracy Vista, talks about the militarization of immigration. So she has a different perspective on the ways in which something like national service is used. She looks specifically at things like conscription in the context of actual military service, and she talks about how oftentimes that's used as a leverage point against people who are undocumented in order to have them fight in the military. So she argues that this notion of citizenship, especially in the context of the United States, is already dripping with things like patriotism. We're always assumed to be the perfect American. We're always supposed to be really happy with American ideas. We fight for things like democracy. We fight for the country we come from. We're gung-ho all American. But what Tracy says is that this becomes really problematic in the context of undocumented youth, especially because they feel like they need to put their lives on the line for opportunities that don't necessarily guarantee acceptance. There's a lot of history that you would find either about minority participation in the military that shows the ways in which, for example, ranks were constantly segregated, or even the fact that statistically speaking, when people are put on the front lines, people of color are the first ones who are sent out to actually fight the battle. Likewise, as a result, many people of color are more likely to have things like PTSD based on the ways in which the military constantly uses their bodies first because they see them as fungible. She argues that in the context of those who are undocumented, that's really terrible because it allows for them to be used literally as commodities in an American machine without guaranteeing them any type of citizenship, especially because she does a comparison between two potential policies, right? So she talks about the MAVNI, which stands for Military Ascensions Vital to National Interest, which is really pushed for by the military because more manpower means more power in terms of the United States getting more hegemony, having a lot more military presence, etc. And they're really pushing for this policy because it offers things like citizenship in order for people to serve in the military. Likewise, she says that oftentimes MAVNI is used in conjunction with the DREAM Act. Is anyone familiar with the DREAM Act? Right? Oh, okay. Well, the DREAM Act is basically legislation that's trying to be pushed for, although it's like probably in danger in this particular regime, that tries to attempt for undocumented youth to be able to get citizenship in this country. So these two things are often used in conjunction with each other to say, hey, if you really cared about being an American, you should enlist in the military. When you have something like mandatory conscription, even if it doesn't apply to the people who aren't citizens, which is an argument that anybody can make on this topic, the argument still applies because the logic is that in order for people to be citizens, they either have to be a part of this conscription or they can buy into this idea of citizenship by joining the military. Next argument, to appease those who are really interested in this guy named Heidegger, he has this argument in the context of called standing reserve. You can find it in the question concerning technology. If you don't have access to that, I'm sure maybe someone has access to it. But his argument is that standing reserve refers to a way of describing the point of view that sees entities or phenomena in a way that only sees them in terms of their economic value. So if someone does something, it is only perceived as something that is good or beneficial based on the economic benefit that comes with it. So you can often read this argument with something like your cap K, or you can try to go hard for all of the things that he talks about in the context of that article. But the reason that this is really specific to this topic is because standing reserve works really well with this understanding of a standing army. In case you didn't catch that before, standing army just means the ability for us to always have manpower in order for us to be military ready. So when we mandate that people join the military, we constantly have people there who can be dispensed in times of war. This is really inconsistent or rather this is very consistent with Heidegger's criticism of this idea of standing reserve because the standing army places citizens into a position of commodity where they're only seen in terms of the value that they bring to the nation state, or they're only seen in terms of the value that they're able to produce either via their literal death or through their man or woman power. Another interesting argument is this argument coming from Paul Virilio. Paul Virilio is a scholar who talks about the spatial dimensions of things like war and how it solidifies a lot of contemporary power. So his argument, in conjunction with things like militarism, as I mentioned before, as well as systems of capitalism, i.e. seeing people and seeing entities and seeing particular values based on the commercial value that they have, he argues that there is a spatial way in which war happens. So he gives examples of countries afflicted by war and the ways in which after war happens, that solidifies the hold that either that current state or regime has over the people or other entities that defeated those nations have over the people who are on the ground. So he argues that the proletariat was created by a form of colonialism that exists when the military comes into power. So, for example, the existence of the military allows for the state to maintain control over certain bodies. When you have a mandatory conscription or you mandate that people end up joining the army, that is a literal way in which the state is allowed to move and displace particular bodies to make sure that they're not able to have particular agency over their body. This turns into a notion, this allows for nation states or groups of people to contribute to a way in which the state can become basically a war machine, as it is no longer a collection of individuals living in a particular society, but rather a machine that's used to kill and destroy and deal other forms of harm to other people. He argues that this is endo-colonialism, and he writes about this in the Popular Defense and Ecological Struggles. You can also probably find access to that. If not, I suggest buying a book or something. But it allows for the state to be able to create this idea that security is something that we always have to prioritize. Control is something that we always have to prioritize. So intervention becomes constantly warranted. If people are mandated to be a part of the army, if people are mandated to always be in conjunction with the state, if people who are mandated to place their bodies in terms of value of the state, that allows for the state to monitor, control, and surveil them at any time necessary, because anything can be deemed a threat, and they have to resolve it in any way possible. So those are like 4 very generic critical arguments that you can try to go for on the negative.
When you're looking at more philosophical arguments on the negative side of this resolution, the most common thing you'll come across is arguments about the importance of the concept of liberty or autonomy. The idea that people should be able to, in some sense, and in such an important senses, control their own lives, control what it is that they do. There's lots of different reasons that this sort of liberty or freedom to control what you do is important. One reason is because you might think that there are certain rights that we have to choose our own actions. If this is correct, which it seems plausible to think that it is, then it may be that there is something deeply wrong about things like conscription and the way that they ignore an individual's own will. They restrict an individual's ability to choose what they get to do with their own life. Now, obviously, governments do this in lots of ways all the time. When the government says, I can't murder someone, they restrict my ability to murder people. That doesn't seem problematic. But you might think it's much more problematic if the government's going to force me to do something, because that's a much bigger restriction of my freedom, perhaps. That my ability to control my own life is impinged a lot more by being forced to go and engage in Peace Corps than my life to be restricted to just not being able to, let's say, vote other people. This would most likely be found in what's known as the tradition of libertarianism, which is a philosophical and political philosophy which focuses a lot on the rights of the individual and thinks that most government action is incompatible with those rights. However, while many of you who want to read philosophy and Cs will likely appeal to libertarianism, I don't think it's that good an idea. Largely because I think it's kind of a silly philosophy. And it's also just not necessary on this topic. Like, libertarianism is sometimes useful in debate when, like, the act doesn't really violate people's rights that much, so you need a really extreme position about individual rights. But national service or conscription is a very significant rights violation. Or we think it's a much bigger violation of our freedom than things like, let's say, taxation is. And if that's true, then you might not need a political philosophy that's so anti-government. You could have a more moderate political philosophy that would still say that certain types of freedom are important. So John Rawls, for instance, argues in his book, A Theory of Justice, that military conscription could only be justified in the event of the imminent threat to the survival of the nation. So like if we are currently under invasion, then the government can conscript people. But otherwise, it cannot. Immanuel Kant seemed to think something similar. These would provide more moderate approaches to the importance of freedom, which would not have to say all freedom is absolute, but would just say that in this instance, freedom is not nearly as important, the freedom is important enough that we don't want to do something like military conscription. There are some other negative arguments that you might also find interesting. One argument talks about harms of intergenerational inequality that follow from military conscription. So if we were to institute military conscription now, that's going to impose a harm on people currently 18 to 20, which benefits people much older than that. You might worry that this creates a sort of inequality in society by expecting one part of society to pay a cost that other people in society reap the benefit from. Another position you'll find talks about how national service might be incompatible with certain types of values that we as people should act in accordance with. So we generally talk about something called volunteerism, the idea that it's really good to give your time to important causes. Likely your school expects some amount of community service that you are supposed to do. The hope for these projects is that by requiring you to do community service, you're more likely to do community service in the future. However, there's some interesting arguments that say actually requiring people to volunteer makes them less likely to volunteer on their own. Volunteering becomes a chore rather than something you really value and choose. And so it's sort of impossible to really be volunteering a generous person with your time if the government's going to force you to do this for a certain period of your life. Instead, it's just going to result in people in thinking, oh, I paid my time, right? I did my work, that's the end of it. Imagine if the government were to tax people primarily for the purpose of just like donating to charities rather than using this for like government policies. You might worry that a lot of people, if you did that, would begin to think, well, the government's taxing me, so I don't have any obligation to give to charity anymore. And you might think that's worse for the ethical character or virtue of the citizenry. This is an argument that various people make, that compulsory service, compulsory national service, is going to decrease the virtue of people in a society. They're going to become worse people. One final argument, which you might look into, talks about the Constitution. While the Supreme Court, at least currently, seems to think that military conscription does not violate the 13th Amendment, it's not altogether obvious that it doesn't violate the 13th Amendment. The 13th Amendment I can't say what specifically. That would. Involuntary servitude, except as punishment for crime where the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist in the United States, or any place subject to their jurisdiction. Well, it certainly seems like any sort of national service that's compulsory is involuntary servitude. What exactly servitude amounts to is a subject of some legal debate, and the Supreme Court currently seems to think that it does not count for things like national service. But, according to some research that Jacob did, previously, the Supreme Court actually did think it violated it. It's just a case never came to trial in front of the Supreme Court, so they weren't able to actually rule on it. But apparently, which Supreme Court justice was it? Do you remember? Oh, never mind. I'm getting my Jacobs confused. Oh well. Similar in some ways. Not that many ways though. Yeah, so there seems to be some literature that there is a incompatibility with the Constitution, and you might think that it'd probably be a really bad idea for the government to violate core constitutional amendments to protect our basic rights. That seems to be a plausible idea, that would be a bad way to check back against government power, if you were to not expect the government to follow the Constitution, which is one of the main ways which we enshrine rights within a legal system. Before we do the demonstration debate, are there any questions that people have about the topic as they begin their research? Yeah?
For like the more moderate Kantian view as opposed to libertarians, what would that look like?
Well, so Kant isn't a libertarian, and so it would just be defending his political philosophy. Kant thinks that you cannot, for instance, violate people's rights just for, let's say, any random social good, but you can to maintain a just system. So, for example, Kant thinks that the government can't just be like, hey, I'm just going to take your water bottle and go use it for something else, but they can tax you because taxation is necessary to maintain a civil society in which rights can be manifest. Similarly, Kant would seem to say, at least it doesn't exactly say it outright, but there are passages which imply very strongly that military conscription could only be justified not to like do good things for a society, but instead to maintain the existence of a just society. So if we were under imminent threat of attack, and the government was to be dissolved if it could not muster defense, then it might be okay to conscript people, because freedom could be violated to maintain a society. But you cannot just violate freedom in such a massive way, just sort of willy-nilly to promote various social goods or to help other people. This is talked about a little bit in Arthur Ripstein's book, Force and Freedom. If you look at that book, you should look for the section where he talks about the nation of Germany when they were trying to decide whether or not they should shoot down a plane which had been hijacked. And the nation decided no, they shouldn't, because even though those people, even though the plane might kill a bunch of other people, you can't kill the people currently on the plane because it's not like Germany's at risk. You could conscript people if like Germany was at risk, but not just to like save some other lives. That's not a serious enough threat to the society to justify those rights violations.
Red shirt?
I've seen some definitions of national service being defined as already compulsory, or already compulsory, sorry. Is there any potential for like a tautology case, or do you have any advice for running against someone bringing it up?
So what I would think of in that context is, supposing you had two definitions of national service. One that says it's necessarily compulsory, and one that says it's not. And one of those definitions, the one that you're suggesting, makes the resolution just trivially true and impossible to debate. And one of them allows for a fruitful debate. That would seem to suggest that the latter is a much better definition. And so even if you were correct that in some contexts the term national service might be used to imply just definitionally compulsory, that clearly seems not to be the answer to the resolution when they say national service, because otherwise it would just be trivial to call it compulsory at the end of the resolution. And so I think that definition is obviously not a good one, and should lose to any basic negative argument that just makes the debate impossible. There's another hand somewhere over there.
Can you explain again in the pragmatic negative arguments how having a national thing would cause political controversy and the shifting of political opinions?
So two distinct arguments. One is the passage of a draft. Like imagine Congress signed into law a new act that allowed the draft. That itself would be very politically controversial. At the moment, these votes go like 400 something to 1, horrible odds against the person in favor of the draft, because it's almost pretty universally hated. And so at the moment, most politicians are going to be strongly against it. Since the Vietnam War, this has been true. It wasn't always true. Actually, during World War II, for example, the draft was actually very popular. People were like, we want to live, and we recognize that national defense is important. And so they were, even in the male 18 to 25 segment of society, the ones most affected by the draft, were willing to support the draft. Nowadays that's no longer true. And so if you were to say, pass a draft, that would cause massive political upheaval, because it would be extremely politically unpopular. And you could imagine various negative impacts that follow from that. The second argument, which is separate from that, is that supposing the draft were passed, what sort of long-term ramifications does that have on the political spectrum? Well, at the individual level, there's some evidence to suggest that national compulsory military service might cause people to shift in a conservative direction as individuals. And then there's also countervailing evidence to suggest that perhaps at the organizational level, the military itself might become more liberal, because many people who are liberal will be less likely to serve in the military voluntarily. And so a compulsory draft changes the demographics of the military in a way that more people are leaning more towards the left. And so you could argue back and forth whether those various shifts, individually, organizationally, whether they're significant, whether they're positive or negative impacts, that sort of argument. Back here?
So for education apps, why wouldn't they be considered topical?
Education as in require people to teach?
Yes.
So one thing to consider is that national service, I think, at least seems to imply some sort of service of anyone in the nation. Everyone when they come of age at 18 does this service, or something close to that. Not national service being like, we pick one random person to do a thing. And so to the extent of the education app for something like people who got teaching degrees are required to teach, one might object to that. It's not national service or compulsory if you only have to do it if you're the small segment of the population that chose to be a teacher, knowing in advance that involves one more extra year of work. Kind of like, imagine an extra year of degree requirement. It's like before you can be a teacher, you have to go do a year of teaching. That doesn't sound compulsory in the same sense that everybody who turns 18 has to serve in the military or has to go abroad and work in the Peace Corps. And so it seems pretty different to attach it to just one specific occupation which you voluntarily enter than to attach it to turning a particular age, which everyone ultimately does.
Yeah, but if you wanted to make an education affirmative that talked about, for example, AmeriCorps, which allows for people to fulfill their national service obligation in the context of teaching, then that can arguably be
of education is there are a number of studies which imply that a draft increases education because people go to college to avoid getting conscripted. And so the rate of college attendance goes up significantly in a world of compulsory military service. Though, it'd be worth noting that also most of your instructors at debate camp could no longer be here because they'd be in the military. So the education arguments really seem to go up both ways.
Anyone else with hands up? Raise them high. I think that might be it.
One last thing
Yeah, so my question kind of relates to what I'm understanding of the revolution. So, national service seems to be kind of a generic term, and that can lend itself to debaters choosing to specify one particular national service, multiple, or just, talk about it in abstract with, some of those arguments about, philosophical arguments and things of that nature. What do you think the understanding or reading of the topic should be, given the phrasing?
I don't think it's. I was gonna say, I think it should be anything you can defend with a word. This definition is super broad. Like, we included the Brennan and Upshaw evidence to just talk about in the broadest context what do people think national service is. But when you're doing topic research, you can go through a bunch of different articles, and so many people have so many different understandings of national service that I think that probably creates a lot of ground for the debate. And then it could really be anything, unless someone has the insights on framers instead. But
Yeah, I don't think there's anything intrinsic to the grammatical structure of the resolution that implies one thing or the other. It's an abstract noun, but those can often represent things with varying degrees of specificity or generality. And so if you're looking for an argument that constrains the topic or makes the topic more open to interpretation, I think it'll probably have to come from the definition of national service itself rather than the syntax of the resolution.
So one last thought before you leave. When I first started researching this topic, I found it kind of hard to get into it. And then I thought, wait a minute, if we did this, that would mean that a few years ago, I would have had to be in the military and not in college. Or I would have had to be in AmeriCorps and not in college. And that was wow, this is weird. And then it became more interesting. So I think when you start thinking about the resolution, maybe you just would be well, do I think in 2 to 4 years of my life, I should have to go do what the government tells me or not? And I think that's a more fruitful way to start thinking about the resolution and think about arguments on either side. How valuable would it be for you to get this experience? How valuable would it be if the government gave everyone this job training opportunity? Or vice versa. All right, so now we're going to split up. The